Okay, hello everyone. My name is Meg Jensen. For those of you who don't know me, I'm professor of English literature and creative writing here at Kingston. And I'm very, very excited, but also happy and in some ways proud to be presenting Joanne Limburg and having her here today. As you know, our topic for this term is parability. And we're going to be speaking today with Joanne Limburg. So Dr. Joanne Limburg has published 2 collections of poetry with Blood Axe Books, one called Feminismo, which was shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best First Collection, and Paraphernalia, a Poetry Book Society recommendation. She's written 1 collection for children called Bookside Down, which is shortlisted for the CLPE Poetry Prize and highly commended. Her latest poetry collection is the pamphlet Autistic Alice, which I have back here on my shelves, also published by Blood Axe. Recently, Joanne has been concentrating on various forms of life writing, memoir, historically based fiction, and auto-criticism. Her first memoir, The Woman Who Thought Too Much, was a best-selling work about OCD, anxiety, and poetry, and was published by Atlantic in 2010. Yes, that's right. And her debut historical novel, A Want of Kindness, which concerns the 18th century monarch Queen Anne, was published in 2015. While Joanne was doing her PhD, she was publishing that book, which had nothing to do with her PhD. So that's kind of the kind of academic that Joanne is. A second memoir, Small Pieces, A Book of Lamentations, concerns Joanne's own relation to the losses of her mother and her brother, and was written in partial fulfillment of her PhD at Kingston, which I supervised. That's a great privilege to supervise. And that was published by Atlantic in 2017, just I think shortly after your Viva. She's been a Royal Literary Fellow at both Magdalen and Newnham Colleges at Cambridge, and a lecturer in creative writing at De Montfort in Leicester. Most recently, she's become a teaching associate in creative writing at the Institute of Continuing Education at Cambridge University. So today, she'll be speaking mainly about her most recent book, Letters to My Weird Sisters, on autism and feminism. And if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you do. There are copies in the library, which, like a proud mother hen, I've ordered. Welcome, Joanne. Very nice to see you. And I thought it might be nice to begin because obviously quite a few of the people in the group are postgraduate students and PhD students, that you might say something about your PhD experience and maybe even ways in which that fed into, in some way or another, this work. So welcome, Joanne.
Oh, total. Thank you, Meg. And if you don't mind me starting by quoting you, I remember right at the outset of our relationship as supervisor and supervisee, I was already a published novel, and you said, okay, you know how to think like a writer, you also need to learn how to think like a scholar. Mm-hmm. And I took that very much to heart, which was the right thing to do, because it meant that I think it made my critical section stronger and more serious. Sometimes in, I think, creative writing PhDs, there's a risk that the critical bit can seem a bit perfunctory and tacked on, but mine very much was and it ended up being almost as long as the creative bit. Was very important. And also that habit of being scholarly fed into the thinking that structured my creative things. So I felt it was very enriching in that way. And Letters to My Weird Sisters is very much a hybrid thing. I mean, it uses sort of creative writing techniques, but, I was I'm glad you're proud of me. I was absolutely meticulous with sources and how I used them and how I found them and how I checked them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely.
A PhD with no corrections you had. A PhD with no corrections at all, so.
The odd typo. Yeah, I've come to realize that's not usual.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not. But I wonder too about the research itself. I certainly remember conversations that we had early on, some of which, seem to have gestated further into the ideas of this book, ideas about writers and autism, in particular about feminist writers and autism. Oops, There you are.
Mhm.
I wonder if you might say something about that.
Yeah, well, I was diagnosed just between being accepted for the PhD and starting the PhD. So we went through the whole process with me knowing that, and with me doing my first, having a disabled student allowance assessment and all this, and learning what it is to sort of perform disability or not perform it, and what it means once you classify yourself under that heading. And so I was doing a lot of thinking around that, and I think GT Tom Cowser came along while I was writing. I was starting to think about publishing, and I was thinking, and I wrote an article about what it means to construct autistic identity, or identity with a late diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, which was kind of separate to my PhD, but which I was very lucky that Tom published in Life Writing. And that was very much
just putting his name in the chat there.
Ah, right.
Sorry, just putting his name in the chat.
Oh, yes, do. Yes. I mean, he's absolutely essential for any life writing person, I think. And for anyone who writes about disability as well, because he's very good on that. So I published that paper. I quoted psychologists and philosophers, Ian Hacking, looping in that paper. It was very much an academic paper, although still kind of dialed down with a lot of personal reflection in, which is what I kind of do. And I think I must have had that at the back of my mind, that I could twist this sort of scholarship and personal reflection together. And also I remember us talking about who might qualify as a weird sister, and and you've obviously studied a lot of Woolf, and Woolf inevitably comes up, and I have to say I've not yet had any pushback from that suggestion, nor would I claim to be the first person to make it.
No, absolutely. And I remember we were talking quite a bit, because it seemed to be a period of time in which neurodiversity was really beginning to become a popular subject of conversation, and it seemed like every week a different person was, either being outed or coming out themselves or talking about their own place on the spectrum. Various members of my own family were being diagnosed at that time. I began thinking about myself, about other people in my family, and that kind of thing. And so we would often talk about it as part of our, PhD sessions, and thinking about ways in which that on the one hand you were approaching various departments, like the disabled advice, disabled person's advice and that kind of thing, but also thinking about what does that even mean? Like, are you a disabled person? Here you are, a highly decorated, writer and stuff, and yet, she's having to go. But that there were things that you did need. So it was very interesting to think about the forms of support that the university was able to give, and all of that. And it was interesting to see that kind of journey, because it was very new, I think, for them too at that time.
Yeah.
And to see someone who had the kind of level of ability that you had, but then also still needing help in other ways.
Yeah,
so I thought,
and I remember
that was really interesting.
And I quoted this episode in that first paper, and then in the book, and I keep doing it, and I feel bad for the person I'm pointing to, but it was just so instructive. When I had my disabled student allowance interview nine years ago, maybe this wouldn't happen now. They said, autism and creative writing, how does that work?
Yes.
And that sort of question, it's one of those questions that set you off on a very long journey, because the obvious answer is, well, look at me, it works just fine, and why shouldn't it? But why is it that people think it wouldn't?
Yes, exactly, because I think a lot of the definitions that we have around autism in particular are something about people not being able to be creative, or not being able to be spontaneous or creative, or maybe not good with language and all those kinds of things. And a lot of what you've done in this book is show the ways in which, particularly in the case of Virginia Woolf in the book, this is not the case. Although I should jump in to say you are not diagnosing Virginia Woolf. You make it very
Absolutely
clear.
not. You know, I'm being, you know, I'm doing the sort of move I wouldn't have been able to do before I started my PhD, because I didn't used to have this kind of language. I say the text, which is what she wrote and what other people wrote her, the surviving text supports an autistic reading. That's what I say, and I'm very careful to put it exactly like that. You know, just like it might support a queer reading, and does.
Exactly. Now, there's a question in the chat, someone saying, I'd appreciate if you'd like to explain if life writing is somehow similar to autoethnography, and in relation to blending the academic and the personal together. I would say that, you know, life writing is, as a term, is an umbrella that covers, you know, it's a very, very wide church that can, I mean, virtually anything could be life writing. A tweet could be life writing. A blog could be life writing, or, you know, more traditionally, you know, an autobiography, a memoir, but a biography is also life writing. So really, it's writing that has to do with the stuff of someone's life, whether your own or you might be writing about the stuff of someone else's life. And autoethnography is a narrow, you know, is one form of life writing. And depending on the definition or the field in which you're working, it can mean very different things. If you're working in psychology, or if you're working as a creative memoirist who is looking into autism, let's say, and so you use your family as an example, but then you may also use scholarly material alongside that to support your, so it's a kind of blend of different things.
Yeah, and it's a way of getting personal scholarship into the academy. I think that's what the term partly functions as. You know, this this is subjective, but that's part of my method, and I'm declaring it.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and it's an acceptable term and form of scholarship, because and I think again, that's something that's relatively recent, I'd say in the last 2 decades anyway, of bringing the personal, you know, into scholarly texts. So I'd like to go ahead now, and maybe, Joanne, if you'd like to say something, maybe about the kind of the overarching idea of the book, and then I know you wanted to a reading from the preface letter.
Sure. Well, it's called Letters to My Weird Sisters on Autism and Feminism, and rather handily and rather nicely, it's got a quote from Steve Silberman on the cover. Steve Silberman, as you may know, wrote a book called Neurotribes, a big, thick, scholarly and also personal book about autism's cultural history and its medical, clinical history, and so on. And without diagnosing anyone, he pointed to figures from the past, such as Henry Cavendish and Tesla, who we might now see as neurodivergent. But as he acknowledges himself, there weren't any women that he looked at. And after I'd finished the Anne novel and had got my breath back, well, after I'd finished the PhD and had got my breath back, I was starting to think about what to do next. And I thought about, oh yes, the prehistory of autism, as it were. You know, given that my assumption is people of my time were always here. What were our lives like? What were we called? Who were we? And I talked to my publisher, and she said, concentrate on women. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. And then inevitably, because I was concentrating on women, and because, as I say in this book, all the times when I look at the times where I've had autistic moments or felt autistic or been seen as weird, it's been when I've contravened some kind of unwritten rule of how to be female. You know, that's not how you're a girl, that's not how you're a mother, that's not how you're a nice lady, that's not how you behave on a date, all that, this stuff. That's not how you present yourself. And I thought, you know what, there really is, to use the word, in an intersection here between femaleness and autism. And, you know, there's something generative there, because just as, you know, if you read Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks, you'll understand something that you're just not capable of understanding as a white person, like I am, although I'm Jewish, so, you know, park that for the moment. But but I thought, what do I know about society and how it works and what it does to women and patriarchal ideology from my specific perspective as a non-conforming weird woman? And the passage I'm going to read is, whenever I read this, people want to know what am I talking about when I talk about autism. And what I prefer to do is avoid clinical categories and use an analogy, and here it is. I'll start by asking you to picture an AA roadmap of Great Britain. If you're under 35, you might want to picture a Google map instead. This roadmap corresponds to the brain and nervous system of a non-autistic or neurotypical individual. I should say, actually, in retrospect, by neurotypical, I mean not ADHD or dyslexic or dyspraxic too. There might be a few minor variations between individuals, but broadly speaking, most of the population is working with this sort of map. To make an autistic map, you first need to take out all the A roads. Replace these with a selection of the other roads, motorways, B roads, and the less well-travelled roads usually referred to as unclassified. Any A road could be replaced with any other kind of road, and the proportions will be different for every individual. You might get mostly B roads and a handful of extra motorways, in which case you'll probably strike people as remarkably talented, but at the same time a little off, a little odd. On the other hand, you might lose out on the motorways altogether and end up with a baroque network of narrow, winding unclassifieds, slowing down and complicating your processing to the point where you experience significant difficulties with sensory input, emotional regulation, initiating action, and motor planning. You may be unable to use spoken language at all, may struggle with basic self-care, and will require a high level of support from others. Most of us will fall somewhere between these two extremes, and no two of us will have the same map. What we have in common is the absence of A roads, the standard ways of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing which non-autistic people share and can use to understand each other and navigate the world they've built for themselves. So you can see I'm not diagnosing anyone. I'm saying, you know, which of these women in the past had a non-standard map. And I think for the method of it, I found another quote from the Virginia Woolf section, which I know particularly wanted me to do. And this almost explains my method, but also I thought these are people who get talked about a lot by other people. I mean, just in The Guardian the other day, there was another essay by a non-autistic identifying parent of an autistic person, you know, basically, you know, apparently not liking what people like me write. No one sees anything wrong with us being talked about as if we're not in the room. So I wanted to sort of turn this around. I thought I will not make us the object of this book. I will make us the interrogators, if that's the right word, interlocutors of this book. So apart from the first letter, nothing's addressed to the reader. It's all addressed to the women I'm writing to. This is about me exploring my relationship with them. People can listen if they like, but this is us talking between us. And this explores that a bit more. So I've read A Room of One's Own, and I'm thinking of that sentence from it that's quoted so often. For we think back through our mothers if we are women, by which you mean not only our mothers literal, but also our mothers metaphorical, all the mothers, including our literary ones. So without your permission, but in the spirit of feminism, I'm going to think back through you, through the living trace of you as it appears in your own words and in the words of others. I won't be the first writer to do so. I certainly won't be the last. Since you stopped living in your body and made a more permanent home in your texts, you've been working at a rate that no breathing version of you could ever match. You do so much representing for people. You do so much standing for things. You are a writer's writer, a modernist writer, a feminist, a woman modernist writer, a modernist feminist writer, a bipolar patient, a depressive, a sexual abuse survivor, a PTSD survivor, a lesbian, a bisexual woman. Orlando and your relationship with the woman who inspired it have made you a significant figure in the discourse around queerness and gender. Your privilege has made you emblematic of the limitations of white middle-class feminism. The way you talked about the women who worked for you, the snobbery you showed in your treatment of certain characters, will come back to that. And certain writers has led to your being derided as the embodiment of the elitist tendencies of literary fiction. You're the writer's woman's writer, but also the elitist's elitist, who didn't get Joyce. And now I've got some more work for you to do. I want to start by visiting some of those unnerving moments I've been talking about, those moments when you stood on a threshold waiting to be judged. As you tell it, you suffered many of the more bruising ones when you were still Virginia Stephen, living at the family home in Hyde Park Gate, in the years between the deaths of your parents, when the pressure of Victorian society, that's Woolf's phrase, on you and your sister Vanessa was at its strongest. This pressure took solid human form in the person of your older half-brother, George Duckworth, who took it upon himself to launch you into society, dragging you through a succession of Victorian social examination rooms in which he was always chief examiner. You were both beautiful girls, beautiful, well-connected girls. And George had every reason on the face of it to believe that your presence at his side would enhance his social capital. He was wrong. Not about your being beautiful or well-connected, but in his assumption that you must want the kind of success that he wanted, or have enough interest in his success to sacrifice yourselves upon its altar. He tried with Vanessa first, but she resisted him and fought him, and although George turned every battery of emotional blackmail upon her, she resisted and she fought, and ultimately she prevailed. So one morning he came to see you in your room, interrupted you in the middle of your Greek, gave you an ugly jewel as a present, and after a strategic silence, proceeded to tell you how much suffering Vanessa was causing. And not just to him, but also to the younger Duckworth brother, Gerald. For how could either Duckworth bring ladies back to the house without a lady present to receive them? What were they to do? Your dearest mother had been the lady, but she was dead. Then Stella Duckworth, his sister, had taken her place, but she had married and left and quickly died in her turn. So that left only the Stephen girls, you and Vanessa was being perfectly monstrous. So it followed that if you could not help, both George and Gerald, starved of more fitting and well-behaved female company, must be driven into the arms of prostitutes. The fate of the whole household was in your hands. So was it to be ruin and degradation of everyone, or would you accompany him to a Dowager Marchioness's ball? You agreed, for how could you not? And your examination season began. As I have said, your chief examiner was George Duckworth himself. Every evening you would have to pass through a succession of rooms in which your appearance, demeanour, speech and conduct were to be scrutinised and judged against the most exacting standards. Every evening, the first room you passed through would be your own drawing room at Hyde Park Gate. The first judge was always George, and his standards the most exacting of all. It was unfair of him to have been so inflexible. He must have been aware of your financial situation and know that you lacked the means to equip yourself for the kind of society he hoped to impress. Even when you were not going out, you and Vanessa were expected to present yourselves in that drawing room at 8 o'clock, with your arms and necks bare, ready to receive. The collision of societies, or George's inexorable demands, and your limited financial circumstances, must have led to so many jarring moments. You describe one in a sketch of the past, and even after 40 years, it still made you sick with shame. So this was an instance where Virginia Stephen thought she'd come up with a great idea. She would wear a dress made of upholstery material, which was cheaper, nice lateral thinking. She came downstairs in it. Her half-brother looked her up and down, as she said, like she was a horse in the ring, and told her to take it upstairs and burn it. She never did destroy the dress, but 40 years later, she tore him a new one in text. So who won in the end.
No, exactly. And you go on and talk about your own relationship to ideas of clothing, particularly what it means to be a woman in terms of your appearance, in terms of clothing, or hairstyle, or any of those other kind of ways of being objectified, and then talk about that in terms of Woolf herself wrote, just as you did there. But I wonder too if you might say something about, even just briefly, about the other women that you've chosen to write to.
Sure.
In this book, the other weird sisters.
Yeah, well, the second one is Adelheid Bloch, and Adelheid was a Jewish woman living in the Lake Constance in the early part of the century, and she had what's either described as meningitis or encephalitis when she was a child, and I don't know what her capacities were before then, but it left her sort of brain damaged and with not much speech, and not very able to regulate her behavior. And when I first came across her, she was described as having symptoms that were quite similar to autism symptoms. So even though, you know, she had this organic identifiable point for her illness, I thought, you know, I don't want to shut her out. And the whole point of that chapter was not to shut out women who are not like me, the ones who don't have PhDs, the ones who don't do well in IQ tests, the ones that people don't look at and go, oh, you don't look autistic. The ones, in fact, that people don't talk to at all. They only talk over and about. So it was very important to me to address her as you and us as us. That was in a way, the entire point of the chapter. And of course, you know, Jewish, early 20th century Germany, it wasn't going to end well, but it ended well. It ended badly earlier for her because she was one of the first victims of a Nazi initiative called T4, which was a eugenics initiative, and whereby they started off sterilizing disabled people. Well, they started off with killing children, actually, and then they sterilized disabled people, and then they killed them. And the mass killing mechanisms that sort of reached their climax in Auschwitz were first tried out upon these people. So poor Adelheid, who's one of the first people to die in a gas chamber. And I spent, if you look at her notes, the last guy who examined her, it says two things. It says idiocy and it says life unworthy of life. And so I trace the history of those two concepts and what they mean, and I interweave pictures of my own clinical encounters as a child. So I had trouble with speech, believe it or not. I was taken to a speech therapist. I was taken to an educational psychologist. And I look at the sort of developments that led to certain conclusions being drawn about me from that ed psych encounter, and certain very different conclusions being drawn about other people who've had very different results from this same over-determined battery of tests. And I also look, I'm jumping chapters. The next chapter, which is kind of linked, that's editor Frau V. Frau V, nobody knows who she really is. I asked Uta Frith and she said, because, you know, Asperger's clinic was bombed, the records have gone. So no one will ever know who this woman was. Probably. But she was the mother of one of the patients in Asperger's classic paper. And what's so interesting
is for those who don't know, sorry, that's Hans Asperger, who was the clinician who first coined the term or coined the diagnosis, and then it was termed Asperger syndrome, which now
retrospectively it was termed Asperger.
Retrospectively, syndrome. Yes.
Yeah, but he was one of the first people to sort of identify this group of children, as it always was then. But he saw it as a kind of a male thing and kind of linked to a male type of intelligence, despite the fact that the way he describes Frau V, he says she was remarkably like her son. She was, you know, not ladylike. She didn't manage her house very well. She was scruffy. She was abrupt. She was very serious and intellectual. When everything got too much, she'd like walk off into the hills. And I thought, and then later in the same paper, he says, this is a male thing. I thought, oh, come on. But through her, I look at motherhood, because being a mother is one of the most overdetermined bits of being a woman. Of the many, many ways in which one can be a woman. But, you know, they have a particularly powerful relationship in the cultural imaginary. So it was a way of writing about my own experiences as a mother and realizing in retrospect the bits that were how my autism inflected it and affected it, and also looking at you can't look at autism and motherhood without looking at the figure of the refrigerator mother. And she emerges out of sort of Frau V's sisters in the paper from Leo Kanner, which was the classic autism paper that first came through, which was from the 1940s from Johns Hopkins in the States. And he started this trend of though psychoanalysis was very influential in psychiatry at that point, psychodynamics. And there came this idea that these children were like this because their parents have been, and mothers in particular, have been mechanical and cold. And the women that Kanner is describing, rather like Frau V, doesn't seem to me to be anything wrong with them, but they do seem to be neurodivergent. In which case, the fact that their children were like that was, probably genetic. But I look at the effect this has had on discourse around autism and mothers, and how we're still dealing with the fallout from that today. And because there was a great reaction to it in the figure of the cultural figure of the autism hero, her hero mother, either saving her child from autism or defending her autistic child from the world. And I look at how both my anxiety about being an autistic mother and about difficulties of autism motherhood arise from the fact that we seem to think that mothering is something you do alone. And so at the end, I bring in Sarah Ryan and Catherine Runswick-Cole's idea of unmothering, which is we mother as a community, we mother as a disability commons. We understand that we're all dependent, we all have needs, we all have interrelationships. And that to me is the not very simple answer. So then the last one is another mother. It's a letter to Katharina Kepler, who was Johannes Kepler's mother, the astronomer and mathematician. And her life is unusually well documented for an illiterate, typical illiterate, lower middle class woman of her time, although I don't think the class is quite mapped on in that way, because her son defended her in a witch trial. And so
glad you got a witch in there.
Yeah, I mean, I really wasn't sure if I was going to for a while, but I did in the end. And I look at, so I've looked, with Adelheid at not speaking, with Katharina Kepler, it's both speaking out of turn, speaking in the wrong way, having the wrong sort of expression on your face, pissing people off because they think you're a bitch, which is something, an experience common, I think, to all autistic women. And so I looked at how I learned to mask to get beyond that, how it's still there, and how I'll read another section, the last section.
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah, because I realized that in constructing this character I called socially gracious Joanne, that it didn't just involve me responding to oppression. It involved me pushing levers of privilege that other women wouldn't have. And that was a very important lesson for me. And I realized that the sort of woman I've been brought up to be is, you've seen it played out in publishing recently, No Names, a sort of middle class woman who exercises a kind of soft, benevolent power. But it's power nonetheless. Anyway. So SGJ, socially gracious Joanne, is middle class. SGJ is white. SGJ can pass for neurotypical. The protection she affords would not be available to me if I were unable to speak or to suppress the characteristics which mark me out as other. In a post on their blog, Cussin' and Discussin', Mel Baggs, a late autistic advocate, explained that in a society which judges people by their ability to conform to an emotionally muffled, verbally indirect, distinctly middle-class mode of relating, people with developmental difficulties must always be at a terrible disadvantage. People with developmental disabilities may find it harder to pretend we are feeling something we are not. These are Mel's words. We might find it harder to detach ourselves from what we are feeling. We might find it harder to act as if we don't notice something that is happening. We are sometimes more direct or blunt in our communication styles than usual. We might find it hard to act like someone is our social better, even if we are trying to be respectful. We might find it hard to speak indirectly or abstractly about something we are feeling right now. We might find it hard to speak at all if we are feeling strongly and may communicate through other means. We might find it hard to pretend we perceive the world differently than we do. We might find it hard to be abstract about something that's very concrete to us. This is a passage from a post entitled "Nice Lady Therapist and a War Against Human Emotion." The term nice lady therapist was coined by another autistic blogger, Rabbi Ruti Regan, as a way of describing certain female professionals who harm the children they are supposed to be helping, who inflict invalidation trauma, but do so in ways so subtle and so generally acceptable that they may not even be aware they are doing it themselves. The nice lady therapists will tell their charges that whatever they do to us is by definition nice and good for us, and that we like it, and that they love us, this is Ruti Regan, and that they are rescuing us, and that we are grateful. And this is me. They work in brightly coloured therapy rooms and sessions filled with toys and praise and rewards and smiles, and yet, Ruti again, every interaction with them is degrading in a way that's hard to pinpoint and hard to recover from. These interactions include treating a child as if they were younger than they are, forcing a child to do something frightening or painful while forbidding them to express pain or fear, as it hurts their feelings to see a child upset. Sometimes it's a matter of being expected to accept intensely bad advice as though it's insight, such as being told the way to make friends is to try harder with the kids who are rejecting and bullying them. Sometimes it's even touching a child invasively and against their expressed wishes, while telling them it must be for their own good, because by definition, anything the nice lady therapist says or does is good and nice and nurturing. When I read these posts by Baggs and Regan, they chilled me to the bone, not just because I remembered what had sometimes been done to me, but because I saw for the first time exactly who SGJ was trying to be, that it was not good to be her. SGJ does not respect my experience or my feelings as an autistic person. When I'm being SGJ, I'm treating myself as the little girl playing teacher treats the recalcitrant doll she must move around, speak for, and chastise. She forces me to do and tolerate things that make me uncomfortable, unhappy, and drained, while telling me that she's only acting for my good and for the good of people around me. She tells me that my resistance to her comes from a side of me that must be disavowed, the side that it identified with those other autistics, such as Mel Baggs, whose fate I am privileged, through SGJ's good offices, to escape. SGJ wants me to feel good that I'm not Mel Baggs. She wants me to pity and distance myself from them and other autistic people like them. She wants me to do this, even though Baggs' activism has helped me find myself and write these very words. SGJ is the personification of my internalized ableism, and as such, he perpetuates harm not only to me, but also to my fellow autistic people who cannot or do not pass as neurotypical, and who do not or cannot let it go when autistic people as a class are harmed or erased or insulted.
Thank you very much, Joanne. It's so interesting. I think one of the things that I find both kind of confusing and troubling on your behalf is that movement between what you were talking about there, and the idea of passing being seen to be the preferential mode. Of a well-behaved autistic person should make sure that no one else around them is uncomfortable with their difference, right?
Yeah.
And that we should, that you should make it, okay for everyone else. And there's something you talk about early on in the book. You say something about thinking from your own condition as a member of a specialized, marginalized group, autism versus the ideal feminism. But also that it's a kind of challenge to ideal feminism in some way too. So, something around this idea of the ideal that I'm quite interested in here. And actually it speaks to something we talked to Anna Johnson, who is my current PhD student, is writing about sort of motherhood and thinking about idealized motherhood and autism. And disability in general. But I wonder if you might just say something more about that idea of the ideal feminism
Woman.
in relation to autism.
Oh, do you mean ideal femininity or ideal?
Sorry, yes, ideal femininity. I'm confusing
Yeah, sure.
the title of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yes,
sort of explore it a lot in the first and last chapters. So when I'm looking at Virginia Woolf, when I'm looking at presentation and appearance, which is, comes to the fore when you're a young woman, actually also sort of natural nurturingness and maternality and running after people, which comes to the fore when you're a mother. And then in terms of the Kepler thing, that sort of soft labor that we're supposed to do the whole time, which is the idea that it's up to women to how we maintain the atmosphere in a room. So a man can come out and disrupt it and say something awful, and we'll go, oh, it's just him. But the woman will smooth it over. The women will never be the one who speak out of turn or disrupt the calm surface of the interaction. And I thought, that seemed to me a very feminist point, that we're having to do all this work. And actually, I mean, I don't think actually it comes entirely naturally to any woman. But I think it's thrown into sharp relief when, like me, you have to work harder to read a room and respond to it. I think it's tiring for all women, actually. We're just so brought up to it that we don't realize that's what we're doing. And you only recognize it in the breach. So like the resting bitch face thing, if I'm walking down the street and my face doesn't look right, I mean, I realize that sometimes people think I'm angry with them or cross with them or disapproving because I've done nothing with my face. I thought, well, I can't do nothing with my face. I can't have a relaxed face. I've got to maintain somehow this background sort of simpering, as I call it, as I walk through the world, or I will cause offense simply by being myself.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the, I suppose the point about feminism is we talked quite a bit, you and I, about how, just as you say, that in a way, what autism does in this particular case is kind of shine a light on the ways in which the idealized gender roles are social constructs.
Yeah.
And because autism itself tends to take social constructs apart bit by bit to see how they work.
Exactly.
And tends to
I mean,
then
you're
explode
putting
them
it really
often.
well. Yeah. Because for the reason I can pass is because I can use the bits of cognition I do have to construct something to kind of compensate for the bits that are either, depending how I don't like a deficit model, but that there's a certain, I think, way of social thinking that most people have that I don't. And in order to compensate for it, I've got to, as Hannah Gadsby calls it, gather data, look at exactly how to behave in a situation and memorize it and process it intellectually and then say, okay, do this. So it's like you're constantly somewhere between an actor and a simultaneous translator. And it can become second nature if you do it enough, but it's still second nature, and it still drains your resources in a way that's, I don't know what it's like to be anyone else. I imagine it doesn't if you're not autistic.
And
And
also, absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and also because the learning is conscious, you can be more critical about it. You don't take it for granted. It's like, really? This is just how things are done? Well, why? What's actually going on here? And why does it have to be like this?
Absolutely. And I think some of the women that you and I have discussed as where, the texts written by some of these women certainly would uphold, a reading of potential autism or difference or otherness in terms of social expectations, are often also women who wrote much about gender and deconstructed gender. So people like Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte, Emily Dickinson, who not only reinvents poetry in the poetic line because she understands metaphor differently
Mm.
It's so fantastic. But also questions, completely explodes ideas of gender and what gender might be, and asks questions that are uncomfortable
Mm.
questions. But so we have that on the one hand, but then we also have your experience of sometimes feeling that you weren't performing your autism well enough to get the support that you needed.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely fascinating as well. And it's interesting, this kind of, and you talk quite a bit about intersectionality
Yeah.
in the opening, and I think which is an absolutely fantastic. If you read the book for nothing else, any of you who are interested in ideas of intersectionality, Joanne gives an absolutely wonderful explanation and kind of like parsing all ideas around it and referring to lots of key texts. So it's a great use for anybody who's thinking wants to use some of those ideas. So the opening chapter of this book for that. But then you also talk about, or the last thing I'll ask you about, we're thinking about this, the failing to be autistic in some ways, or perform autism in some ways. That you put as an appendix at the end of your book this dishuman manifesto. And I wondered if you might just say something about that, because I think it speaks very much to the ideas of parability that we're talking about more generally. So if you say something about that, and then I'll turn over to questions.
Yeah, so I have it pinned to my wall, so I can just say it. Dishumanism is about unpacking and troubling dominant notions of what it means to be human, and celebrates the disruptive potential of disability to trouble these dominant notions. So again, it's the idea that if you have a body mind that kind of disrupts these social things, then that these sort of social and cultural patterns, their smooth operation, then that becomes a generative site from which you can start to think about how things might change and how you might broaden definitions. So for example, if you look at the definition of adulthood, well, obviously, you go through school, you go through, this year at that age, and you do this exam at that age, and then you get a job, and then you support yourself, and then and you have sex with someone, and you set up house with one of the people you have sex with, and you don't have sex with anyone else, and then because you're grown up, and then you have children, and you bring them up to do exactly what you did, and that's what adulthood is. And and actually you can turn it around and say, really, is that the only way to be an adult? And I think queer theory has been great with this, because gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender asexual people, they've all had to find different ways to be adult. And so a lot of a certain strand of disability theory has borrowed a lot from queer theory, from queering these things and saying, well, maybe maybe kinship's not important to me. Maybe I have, what Armistead Maupin would call my logical family. Maybe my friendships are more important to me than my relationships. Maybe I can't, support myself, but I do my work through how I support other people and through producing art, even if it doesn't have a, market value. And maybe I don't need to meet conditions in order to be allowed to be alive. I'm just here. That's that.
That's right. And I'm here, and it's not my job to make you comfortable with that.
Exactly. And also, actually, I think, once we've been brought into the world and none of us decide to, I think it does owe us a living, frankly. I think it's just outrageous that we've allowed it to be a tenet of common sense that we're not owed a living. I would totally flip that. And also, the other thing about being dishuman is dishumanism emphasizes that ourselves are distributed. It's against this idea of the independent individual subject as the kind of paradigmatic person, that we are distributed, we are interdependent and interpersonal. And that's how our identities and our beings are constituted. And that's not a disruption from the norm, that is the norm. And if we think we're independent, we're deluded.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's often why that very notion that to be a human being is to be independent is insidious, because it suggests that anyone who needs that kind of help or looking after is therefore not.
Yes.
And we know that obviously to not be true. Well, thank you very, very much. And I'll see, love to turn it over and see if any of you have questions. You could either take to the mic or take to the chat, whichever you prefer. And if you have any questions about what we've been talking about, or other questions about life writing, or autism, or indeed feminism, psychology, Joanne's got it all. So
Some of it.
And if not, she'll fluff. It'll be fine. Okay, I see somebody's right. Oh, Nicola, yes, please.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Joanne. Lovely to meet you. I've read your book that I can't remember the name of at the moment. Anyway, not that one, but previous. Recommended by Meg, of course. Anyway, yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm probably not going to make a sort of nice round packaged contribution, but I got so many different sort of spokes to hang, from you about hanging, and something that came up right at the very end when you say, if you think you're independent, you're deluded. I mean, I would challenge the word deluded.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm sure you know why, but
yeah.
I think if you think you're independent, you have swallowed the myth that we are fully civilized and productive human beings only if we are able to, go to work, do a job, pay the rent, not get into debt, never feel insecure, always be able to cope with everything, etc. And that is the way to be. And if you are not that, then you better hide it, and you better pretend you're independent. And, all the people that when you say, how are you? They say, fine. When actually they're the walking wounded, And it reminds me also of the disability arts tenets of not celebrating, but acknowledging human fragility as being an essential characteristic of being human. And you're not, and it's not just, as you put it, normal, or what was it you said, being interdependent is normal. It's the fact. It's the fact. It's the fact. It's not even got a moral quantity to it.
No.
We simply are social beings. And that, so out of that comes sort of questions for me about historicizing what you're talking about, because concepts of family, relational contexts, and motherhood, and what women should be like, can be like, and so on. Of course, they're evolving, although they have a kind of material root in the family where the nurturing aspect is, of course, fundamental. They do change. They've changed over time. And, as we know, our generation is different from the previous generation, and so on, in terms of function and the way society is organized, even though the family is persisting. And that's what I'm doing in my research, is the persistent material socio-economic role of the family despite all the changes. And I think that you're right, again, in many ways, that it is people who've not been able to be normative or appear normative or convince themselves to be normative that have created alternative ways of being, or have envisioned and provided alternative ways of being. But I can assure you that the people I know who don't identify as any kind of minority struggle to be that norm, struggle to be those norms. It hurts. it hurts, it's pressurizing, it gives you a headache, it stops you sleeping, it makes you drink, and so on. So I just wanted to say that, you know, I'm very glad this work's being done, and I failed to perform having ME and chronic fatigue in my PIP assessment, and because I look and PTSD, because I made hand gestures which showed that my hands were very capable of chopping vegetables, and also because I maintained eye contact with the assessor, therefore I didn't have post-traumatic stress disorder. The fact that I was glued to my torturer and reading their every expression, you know, it's just cruel, horrible, and we've got to get rid of this system and have a revolution. So I'll finish on that. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I agree with you. For the people, everyone's suffering. The people who are managing to conform to the norm, they're chopping bits off themselves to do it and driving themselves mad. And the people who can't, there's a sort of necropolitical pressure being put on them, literally, by organisations like PIP, and they're made to feel they're in the shame corner, and it's not sustainable for anyone. So yeah, I agree with you. Bring it on.
People have died because of it. I mean,
and also their diagnostic tools are 10, 15 years behind as well. So I mean, that, you know, that's another big issue, that they're working with old news and old materials in an incredibly fast-moving field. So
old guidelines, but which serve their purpose. You know, I'm too lazy. You know, it's still predominantly thought of that you know, just will try a bit harder. You know what, if you walk 100 steps more every day, eventually you'll be able to walk 10,000 steps, and then you'll be better and you'll be normal and you'll feel much better. Just try. Go on. Give yourself a challenge. Fuck off. Anyway, sorry,
okay, thank you, Nicola.
Thank you,
Nicola, for your revolutionary comment. Sarah, we have a question from Sarah.
Hello.
Hi, Sarah.
Thank you so much for that, Joanne, and so many things that resonated with me. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And it's great just to have a space for this discussion. I wanted to ask you something about form, because it strikes me that you're quite unique in the fact that you have worked with all these different forms, you know, the life writing, the poetry, the novel. And I wondered what draws you to particular forms, and is there a relationship between what you're trying to express and the form that you choose? How do you find those moments for different modes of expression?
Oh gosh, well, it's a sort of kind of negotiation between the subject matter and what I mean. I still keep confusing the people I teach fiction to by saying I'm not a fiction writer, because I very much felt as if a want of kindness was some kind of weird accident. I was trying to write a non-fiction book about Anne and about pregnancy loss, and I realized that there were too many gaps for me that needed filling in, so I was forced to write fiction. And it felt like the material and the conditions.
The novel about Queen Anne. Sorry.
Queen Anne. Yeah. That who lost a lot of pregnancies, sadly, that forced me to do that. And I don't know if it's a kind of synesthesia. I mean, it took a very long time to kick in with form was the main issue that I grappled with, and Meg grappled with me when we were writing small pieces, because I had a vision in my head of there were two visions. There was one of Cornelia Parker's exploded shed, and there was another one of a vessel in pieces, a film of it going backwards to show it coming together. So I start off with form with some kind of weird visual intimation, and then I have to find a way to realize it through words. So by the time, you know, it's achieved its expression, I can usually articulate it. But weirdly, for someone who works in writing, I'm always trying to translate something from something non-verbal. I just have a sense of form. I doubt I'm the only person who has it. It's not something I've seen written about. But I'm wondering if there's this sense of form that isn't any of the other senses. It just is a... Because I'd be very, very surprised if I was the only person who had it. I just know, oh, it wants to be that shape.
Yeah, that's really a lovely way of explaining it, and you know that it makes a lot of sense to me. I think I found myself that as my, you know, I'm someone who comes from a literary critical background, and as I've touched on issues that are more personal to me, I've certainly felt that it demanded a different form. But then it's also made me think about the existing form that I wrote in and whether somehow that needs to change. And I wonder whether working across these different forms has also made you think differently about what those forms conventionally are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of give in all of them, and they do blend into each other. I think there's a constant negotiation and a constant push and pull between the pressure of what you're trying to express and the cultural what's the word, resources that you have at your disposal, the tools, the techniques for expressing. And so you're constantly trying them out to see which work. But of course there are these other pressures as well. I find straight down the line academic writing virtually impossible to do without extreme discomfort. And that's partly why I haven't, you know, gone for a conventional academic career. My thoughts will not fit in that. And so it becomes very hard to sort of write the sort of proposals that will get you the grants or get you the publications that, you know, are structured through academe. So there are always these different pressures operating on it. There's the pressure of what you're trying to express. There's the pressure of the material. There's whatever the shape of your own brain is. And then there's the audience and the context, the economic context that you're writing in. And somehow we all have to find our own way through.
Thank you.
And Sarah, I would also say now, you know, in the past 5 years or so, I've supervised lots of PhDs that are around life writing, and in particular people who have experienced, you know, had traumatic experiences or great suffering, or, you know, grief experiences that have not been fully, you know, accepted or and those kinds of things. And that it seems to me that what's really unique in every case, and we found with Joanne, is how long it takes to get to the form and how important that form is. And I've come to believe that the form itself is like a safety net for the expression of great emotion. So that if we think about, you know, poetry, that I kind of think the reason that poetry begins with having these tiny little lines is because you're trying to say something so painful or so evocative or so, you know, so emotional that you can only say it this big, you know, it can only be said in this tiny, it's got to be contained or else I might just disappear off the page or whatever. Or at least, anyway, that's how I feel about it. And I think often about...
There's almost a felt physical pressure of silence.
Yes.
Yeah.
That we need that silence on the outside so that I could have this little scream moment within it. And that whatever the form of that life writing becomes, whether it's a series of letters, you know, as this might be, or in Joanne's memoir, it was pieces of a vessel, and each chapter is a different piece coming together towards a vase that might at the end be restored, although it can never be fully restored. That any of those kinds of things, where people might do it the months of a year, or, you know, all their experiences over the course of 5 years, or whatever it is, it takes forever, and every piece of life writing goes through 20 different forms.
That's really
before
interesting.
Finally, somehow.
So that kind of difficulty I had has been played out subsequently. Yeah.
Yes, for every piece where it's dealing with traumatic experience of some kind, yeah. So it's the exploded shed, as you say. The exploded shed is the trauma, and then how can we possibly write that? Because it's all gone. But it isn't all gone. And which pieces do we bring together? And whatever we come to at the end with it will be incomplete, but hopefully perfect within that incompleteness.
Yeah, and it makes it very hard within a system that wants you to say what you're going to do, when the whole essence of it is that you don't know, and if you knew, you wouldn't need to do it.
Yes. But life writing, I mean, trauma writing is, is necessarily obviously fragmented and that kind of thing. But there's also, the art, I think, then is to find the form where the form itself, the aesthetic of that moment itself, shows the traces of that painful past or process, shows the traces of that process of its own pain, and its own difficulties. Do we have any other questions? Any other hands up? Okay, and I think that some people are needing to head off. Well, I suppose if there are no other questions, just leaves for me to say thank you so much, Joanne. It was absolute pleasure, and I know it was very useful to everybody, especially our PhD students, to get to hear from you. And as I said, the book itself is fantastic, as are all of Joanne's books. And it's my great pleasure to have been your supervisor and now your friend.
Yes. Yes, and likewise, only the other way around.
Yes.
No, it's been really lovely to come back to Kingston and see some familiar faces and some new ones as well, and have this really great conversation.
Well, thank you, and we'll be sharing the video shortly, or by tomorrow or something.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you.
Oh, great.